Interested in learning about wine, but not sure where to start? You're in the right place. Welcome to the Cork and Fizz Guide to Wine podcast. I'm your host, Haley Bowman, and I'm so glad you're here. I'm a wine enthusiast turned wine educator and founder of the Seattle-based wine tasting business, Cork and Fizz. It is my goal to build your confidence in wine by making it approachable and lots of fun. You can expect to learn everything from how to describe your favorite wine to what to pair with dinner tonight, and so much more. Whether you're a casual wine sipper or a total cork dork like myself, this podcast is for you. So grab yourself a glass and let's dive in. When you are listening to this, it will be officially January, which means many people in the US and maybe across the globe, not sure if this is just an American thing, but many people will be participating in Dry January, potentially you included. So I figured what better time to talk about non-alcoholic wines. Of course, there are plenty of other reasons to abstain from alcohol or to choose to drink a non-alcoholic wine. So it doesn't just have to be for Dry January. You can listen to this whenever. Now, before we get into it, I want to give a quick reminder. If you are not on my mailing list yet, I would love for you to join. When you join, you will get a free shopping guide that has 15 of my favorite wines under $15. Of course, for those not doing Dry January or for when you choose to drink again. So simply head to corkandfizz.com, scroll down to the bottom, and there'll be a little section where you can join the mailing list. I send out a weekly newsletter filled with wine tips and recommendations, special offers, and a lot more. And of course, be sure to check out my virtual tasting club, the Cork Crew. We get together every month to try new wines and learn from others in the wine world. Head to my website, corkandfizz.com/the Cork Crew, and use code WINE101 when you sign up to get your first month free. All right, let's dive into these non-alcoholic wines. Okay, starting off, I want to start by clarifying the difference between a dealcoholized wine and a wine alternative. Both of these tend to fall under the non-alcoholic wine umbrella, but they are different. So starting off, you have dealcoholized wine, which is exactly what it sounds like. So first, wine was made as you normally would. You add yeast to grape juice, fermentation happens, the yeast eats the sugar, produces alcohol and carbon dioxide. Then the alcohol is removed from the wine. After that, they will add in any of their additional additives, sometimes carbon dioxide, sugar, and sulfites, to result in your ending non-alcoholic, dealcoholized wine. Now, the important thing here is to know that there is yet to be a process, though feel free to correct me if I'm missing something, but all my research has said there is no process to dealcoholize the wine to remove 100% of the alcohol. So most dealcoholized wines are reliably less than 0.5% ABV or alcohol by volume. This is essentially the same amount of alcohol that you'd find in a kombucha, and any drink is only classified as alcoholic if it contains more than 1.2% of that ABV alcohol by volume. Now, a wine alternative was never a wine in the first place. It's a beverage made to replicate the flavor, texture, and sensation of wine, but it is made with different ingredients. Common ingredients for wine alternatives include tea, fruit and fruit juice. You can add grapes as well, spices, and then complex ferments. Think similar to kombucha. Wine alternatives are usually, and I say usually, 100% alcohol-free, except in situations where those complex ferments create a small amount of alcohol. Okay, so that's the difference between a dealcoholized wine and a wine alternative. Now, another thing that I want to talk about is different terminology when it comes to talking about non-alcoholic wines. Unfortunately, there isn't a worldwide regulatory definition for things like alcohol-free and non-alcoholic. So you're going to have to check to see where the bottle came from to understand better what is in the wine. Because the thing is, many non-alcoholic wines do contain small amounts of alcohol. As I mentioned, if it's a dealcoholized wine, it can contain up to 0.5% alcohol, even if it's called non-alcoholic. So in the US, if you have a bottle of non-alcoholic wine and it was made in the US, it can only say alcohol-free if it actually contains no alcohol. If it's something that contains some amount of alcohol, but it's less than 0.5% ABV, then it's non-alcoholic or alcohol removed. Now, in the EU, that changes. So a lot of your wines coming from, Italy, Germany, Spain, a wine can be called alcohol-free if it has less than 0.5% ABV. And they can actually put on the back label 0.0%. So the reason I'm telling you about this is actually personal experience. I went down a little bit of a rabbit hole researching when I picked up a bottle of dealcoholized Italian wine at a local non-alcoholic bottle shop here in Seattle. It just opened up recently. It's called Cheeky and Dry. Super cute. They've got all kinds of non-alcoholic beverages, I guess I should call them, because, there's versions of beer and cocktails and spirits and wine, of course, non-alcoholic that they contain. And so they had one. I had done this research, and so far my research had told me alcohol-free equals 0 alcohol. But I'd also done the research that said dealcoholized wine always contains a little bit of alcohol at the end, even if it's like very trace amounts. So I found this bottle of sparkling dealcoholized wine from Italy, but on the back it said 0.0% ABV, and on the front it said alcohol-free. And I was very, very confused. So luckily, I was able to message the owner of Cheeky and Dry, and she got back to me right away. Her name is Kirsten. She's wonderful. She helped clear it up and explained that, yes, in different countries, so especially in the EU, they can use the term alcohol-free if it has less than 0.5% ABV. Now, I tell you all this because one of the main questions that I had when I was doing my research is, is non-alcoholic wine safe for those who are pregnant or recovering from alcoholism or just want to have a full, sober life and not drink alcohol? So basically the question, if non-alcoholic wines have small amounts of alcohol in them, are they safe for those people? And the short answer is no. But of course, please don't take this as like the only option. This is just what I found in my research. There are obviously people who are much more experienced, and you are welcome to do what you want to do, but this is what I found. Essentially, for those who are pregnant, no amount of alcohol can be deemed safe. So even if it's less than 0.5%, they can't reliably say it's safe. And the main reason for that is they can't actually conduct studies to show that it's safe, right? It'd be pretty unethical to try out different levels of alcohol when you're pregnant and see what happens. Most of the data that they do have comes from people who report things after the fact. And I'm not saying they're lying. I'm more saying like it's hard to remember all of that. Like, what did you have? How much did you have? And so again, it's really hard to say what level of alcohol is safe. So the best thing is to say none. Also, in a study, this was back in 2010, so it has been a little bit of time and maybe things have changed, but this was a study in 2010. They studied 45 different brands of non-alcoholic wines, and 13 of them, so nearly a third, had higher alcohol levels than the label stated. And certain brands, which claimed to have 0.0% alcohol, had levels up to 1.8%, which actually brings us over that. Remember, an alcoholic beverage is over 1.2%. So that's 0.6% more than that. So again, it's a little unreliable. And so that's why they say no. In terms of people who are recovering alcoholics or choosing to live a sober life, while it's virtually impossible to get intoxicated on non-alcoholic wines, it can still trigger a relief of endorphins, aka those feel-good chemicals in your brain. And this could be enough to trigger a desire for more and lead to relapse for those that are recovering. Also, because non-alcoholic wine and beer is made to taste like wine and beer, it can trigger something called euphoric recall. And this causes a recovering alcoholic to exaggerate positive experiences from the past without remembering the negative things that went along with it. So again, I just share those things. They were curiosities that I had, and I just thought I'd share what I found. But definitely do your own research and learn a little bit more if these things apply to you or somebody that you know. Okay, now that we've had that little overview, let's dive into the history of non-alcoholic wines because, I'm a big history nerd when it comes to anything wine related. So starting off, the first alcohol-free, now I'm doing air quotes, but you can't see it, but the first alcohol-free wine alternative skipped fermentation altogether. So again, this was never a wine in the first place. This was back in 1869. It was a New Jersey dentist and prohibitionist. His name was Thomas Bromwell Welch, which that name might sound familiar. He pasteurized unfermented Concord grape juice, and they used it for communion at his Methodist church. And it quickly spread to congregations across the country. And it was soon known as Dr. Welch's unfermented wine. Now, this was until 1890 when it just got the name Welch's grape juice, because that's all it was. It was just grape juice. But from an ad during that time that was advertising this unfermented wine, it said Welch's is the national drink because clear-headed efficiency is now the national fashion. So I thought that was very interesting that Welch's actually started as unfermented wine when in fact it's just grape juice. It's just grape juice. Okay, so moving forward, I guess actually around the same time in 19th century Germany, the Jung family winemakers were looking to expand the market for their Rieslings. They were finding that they were losing clients who began to abstain for health reasons. So their son, Carl Jung, who not to be confused with the more famous Carl Jung psychoanalyst or whatnot, he discovered the vacuum distillation method that essentially lowered alcohol's boiling point from 80 degrees Celsius to 35 degrees Celsius. And for all the Americans that don't understand Celsius like me, that dropped it to about 95 degrees Fahrenheit. This allowed them to cook out the alcohol, essentially boil out the alcohol without cooking the wine and introducing those bad flavors. If you remember, I did a podcast episode not that long ago sharing about all the different wine flaws, and one of them is cooked wine. If it gets too hot, it takes on these really, just like jammy, overwhelming flavors, and it just loses its delicacy. And so by doing this, they did have to get it pretty hot. 95 degrees is still a little concerning for wine, but it wasn't nearly as hot as at 80 degrees, which I'm just doing the math in my head. I think you multiply by 2 and at 35, it's like 195 degrees Fahrenheit. So 95 is not bad compared to that. Still a little concerning. But anyway, this did work pretty well. And he actually received a patent for this invention. And now Carl Jung Wines produces dealcoholized wines for drinkers in over 25 countries. They might not all still do exactly this method. They might use more of other methods as well, but that's what it started with. Now, our last major moment, NA or non-alcoholic wine history, came in the 1980s in Australia. There was a food chemistry entrepreneur, which I feel like the title must have come after the fact that he was successful, because I don't know where he would come up with food chemistry entrepreneur. But anyway, his name was Andrew Craig. He formed a company called Flavor Tech to produce his invention. And what his invention did is it extracted essential oils from spices and herbs. It could also recover aroma from instant coffee. And it was later discovered by the ad executive and marketing director, Tony Dan, that this Andrew Craig hired, that he could control the alcohol content in beverages using this technology. The invention was the spinning cone column. And the way it did all those things, it removed volatile compounds from liquids with a combination of gentle steam heat and mechanical force. So Dan immediately saw the potential to reduce alcohol. So the first thing they did with this was reduce alcohol. They weren't immediately looking to remove alcohol completely. He figured they could reduce alcohol in wines from warmer climates. So remember, I talk about this in my Wine 101 classes, but warmer climates result in riper grapes, which have more sugar, which means when you do the fermentation process and the yeast eats the sugar, it has more sugar to eat and thus creates more alcohol. So warmer climates result in higher alcohol wines. And some of these really warm climates could produce wines with very, very high alcohol. And wineries could avoid higher taxes if the wine was under 14%. So that's what Dan figured they could use this invention for. They could drop the alcohol levels to under 14%. This worked out for a little while until 2018 when the tax break went up to 16%. Wineries really didn't need to lower their alcohol levels anymore. As much as a 2% difference doesn't sound like much, it's a lot harder to get a wine up to 16% than it is to 14%. So that is when they switched over to the non-alcoholic market. Do you ever feel like you're stuck in a rut, doing the same old thing day in and day out? You wake up, go to work, come home, go to bed, and repeat. When life gets busy, it can be easy to fall into that routine and forget how important it is to prioritize joy and fun. But what if I told you there was a way to break out of that cycle? A way to bring more excitement and adventure into your life. And it involves one of the most wonderful things in the world, wine. Introducing my Cork Crew Virtual Tasting Club. This is not your ordinary wine club. This is a community of people who are passionate about exploring new flavors, learning about different wine styles, and having fun along the way. Each month, we'll select 2 styles of wine to focus on. We'll taste them together virtually, all while learning more about the regions that the wines are from and the grapes that make the wine. You'll also have the opportunity to meet winemakers, sommeliers, and other wine professionals through our monthly community events. But it's not just about the wine. It's about breaking out of your routine, trying new things, and having a little fun. Imagine being able to impress your friends at your next dinner party with your newfound wine knowledge. Feeling confident when you walk into a wine shop, knowing exactly what to look for and what you'll enjoy. Imagine adding a little bit of excitement to your everyday life. So why not do something for you? Come join the Cork Crew Virtual Tasting Club and start exploring the endless sea of discovery and joy that is the world of wine. Sign up at my website, corkandfizz.com/thecorkcrew, and don't forget to use code WINE101 to get your first month free. And now, back to the show. Now, while we're talking about all the ways to de-alcoholize wine, let's dig in a little bit to the methods. Now, I'm going to give you my best overview that I can, but this is very scientific. So my recommendation with these, go check out, there are some really cool videos on BevZero's website. BevZero, it was a company founded by Tony Dan, the marketing and ad consultant for Andrew Craig, who created the spinning cones thing. He created BevZero. And so they have some videos that show how their technologies work that I found really fascinating. And I'm more visual than anything, so those really helped me. But I'm going to teach you. So basically, when you de-alcoholize wine, from what I can tell, you typically do it in 3 steps. So first, you're going to pull out the aroma and flavor from the wine. Then you're going to use heat to remove the alcohol from the remaining flavorless liquid. Finally, you're going to add that flavor back to the liquid that had the alcohol removed from it. Now, the way that they separate out the flavor is a little different. And some methods kind of do it in multiple steps, while some do it all together. So one of the popular methods is membrane separation, and the most popular of that is reverse osmosis. Whenever I think of osmosis, did you ever remember, like, as a kid, you'd say, like, I could learn through osmosis by, like, putting my head up against a book? Like, I don't know why that's still what I think of when I think of osmosis, which is, it's actually a real scientific thing, but that's what I think about. I'm like, learning through osmosis. I have a book against my head. Anyway, please tell me other people did that. This reverse osmosis, there's a filter that separates and retains wine's tannins, pigments, flavors, and aromatic compounds. It allows water and alcohol molecules to pass through. So again, this is where it's retaining that flavor that can then, after they heat up the liquid that doesn't have a flavor anymore, they'll remove the alcohol and then they'll put the flavor back in. The disadvantage of this technique is that it takes multiple passes, as you can only reduce alcohol a max of like 6% each time. And every time you do that, you do lose some of those volatile aroma compounds. The advantage of this is that you can do it at quite low temperatures. Okay. The other method, which seems to be the most popular method from what I can tell, is called vacuum distillation. And this is what BevZero uses, which is one of the leading kind of companies to produce this non-alcoholic wine. or at least to like provide the technology to produce the non-alcoholic wine. So this one is done at slightly higher temps, but there's technology that combines vast surface area and minimal residence time to avoid heat damage. So there are two different technologies or inventions to do vacuum distillation. The first is the spinning cone column, which was created by Andrew Craig that we talked about, the Australian guy in 1980. The spinning cone column is composed of alternating rotating cones that spread the wine out into a thin film. And this allows rapid removal of the alcohol. So the most volatile aroma compounds are extracted from the wine in a quick and gentle first pass. It does this while, so essentially, like if you think about it, moving down, the wine is spread out into these columns as it comes over these upside down cones. And then steam rising upward from the bottom of the column causes these compounds to turn into those volatile aroma compounds to turn into gas. And those are collected and set aside. Then they do a second pass where the alcohol is removed. And I'm guessing that needs a higher temperature to do that, which is why they do it second. Finally, you will do the combination step, which is adding back in those aromas that you set aside to the mostly alcohol removed liquid. So that's a spinning cone column. There's also something called packed columns. This consists of two or more columns as vertical stainless steel cylinders, which are filled with packing material and provide a huge surface area. This makes distillation very efficient. It's actually a continuous process and extracts the aromas and the dealcoholized wine in one single run. Now, when it comes to vacuum distillation, again, the benefits here, you can remove alcohol down to as low as 0.02%. You can also save that alcohol that you're removing out as a byproduct and use it in some other way. As I said before, go check out those videos on Bev Zero's website. I think they're super, super helpful. Just do a Google search for Bev Zero and you'll find them. I can also add them in the show notes for you. Now, one of the biggest questions when it comes to non-alcoholic wine is, how does it taste? Does it taste any good? Like, does it taste like wine? And the thing is, it's very hard to predict the flavor in a non-alcoholic wine. So when you remove alcohol, you're essentially, alcohol has flavor, it has weight, kind of like the body, it has that burn, and it has sweetness. So when you remove alcohol from the beverage, you're removing those things as well. So removing alcohol can result in a very thin, very light body. It can also change the flavor. Some aromas come through after you remove the alcohol and some don't. It's hard to predict which ones. This isn't as much of a problem in non-alcoholic beer because beer has such a lower ABV. So when you think about it, wines generally have anywhere between 12 to 15% alcohol by volume. I'm not a beer person, but from the most part, I've seen 5 to 7% for beers, and 7% is pushing it. So it's not as much of a flavor difference for beer. Now, many winemakers will turn to additives to address this gap. One of the main problems is they can add flavor, they can add sweetness, they can sometimes add body, though they're still working on that, but there's nothing that replaces that burn, which is, the most difficult thing to make it taste like wine. The nice thing about them adding additives, which might sound kind of scary at first, many of these are natural, just like carbon dioxide, sugar, things like that. And they're also actually required to list ingredients because this is no longer a alcoholic wine and does not have that exemption that wine does. So they have to list their ingredients on the back. The other thing to keep in mind when you are trying non-alcoholic wine is that these are young companies. It is new. As much as the history goes back, as far as the 1800s, late 1800s, I should say, for finding ways to dealcoholize wine, most of the companies creating wine these days are quite new. So it's really hard to put these beverages up against wine that's been made for centuries. One of the tips that I read from somebody who owns a non-alcoholic wine shop out, not the one in Seattle, but this was a different one. He recommended if you try something, you're not a huge fan, try it again in a year. There's a good chance that these, every time he tries a new vintage, as you want to call it, though it's not quite the same thing because it's not quite that. But every time he tries a new year's supply, it changes and it usually improves. Last thing before I give you the results of my little experiment that I ran of trying 6 non-alcoholic wines, just want to share how much this trend of non-alcoholic wines is increasing and trending upward. So in 2018, Bev Zero produced less than 20,000 gallons of wine for dealcoholization. That was about 1% of total volume that they had. In 2020, that went up to 3%. In 2021, that went up to 8%. And in 2022, it went up to 22%. So over 300,000 gallons of wine in 2022 compared to 20,000 in 2018. And they are now supporting over 20 non-alcoholic brands. So there's definitely a lot more interest in this. Some of this comes from younger generations having less interest in alcohol, or more interest in moderation, I should say. But they haven't really done enough research to say exactly why there's this higher interest in non-alcoholic wines. Okay, all that said, I thought it would be fun to end this with a little experiment of my own. Part of this was inspired by finding the non-alcoholic bottle shop here in Seattle, Cheeky and Dry. I knew I had to try some of the wines that they had. All of the wines, the owner, who used to be a huge wino before going into sober living, tastes all of these and only includes the ones that she really, really likes. So we knew we'd have to try them. I also had a few still in my cellar from when I purchased a year or so ago. Don't worry, I checked. All of those older wines were still plenty within the expiration date on the bottle, and they were stored in a cool temp cellar. So there's no reason that they would go bad just because I had them for a year. But I just wanted to share that just in case it has anything to do with this, because the thing is, the three that I got from Cheeky and Dry were the three at the top of my list. So that either says that Kirsten, who is the person who found all of them at Cheeky and Dry, really knows her stuff, or that, and I shouldn't keep non-alcoholic wine for over a year in my cellar. But I think it's a combination, if anything. Okay, so I tried 6 wines. There were 2 red wines, 2 sparkling rosés, 1 just sparkling white wine, and then 1 white wine. 5 of them were dealcoholized wine, and 1 was a wine alternative. And I'll make sure I say which one was which when I talk about it. So in 6th place, starting at the bottom, we have Studio Null Solo Garnacha. This was one of the red wines. The smell was promising. It smelled like wine. I got a little bit of plum and even like this like earthy, like wet leaves and soil. And then it also had that grape juice smell that I find that most non-alcoholic red wines have, because they're mostly grape juice at this point. But then I took a sip, and the best way I can put this is the flavor was a hell no. My husband also tried it, and he like made a face like, "Why did you warn me?" And I was like, "Oh, I wanted your true reaction." It really just tasted like juice that had gone bad. It was also like oversteeped tea with how tannic it was somehow, and just very unpleasant. Again, this was one of the ones that I had in my cellar. Maybe it shouldn't have been kept that long, but the expiration date said August of 2024, and I was tasting this in December of 2023. So who knows? Okay, in 5th place was the Giesen, which is spelled Giesen. I'm not sure if I'm saying that right, but it was a Riesling from New Zealand. Again, this was a de-alcoholized wine, so was the last one. And so it's 5th place, mostly out of personal preference. I'm not a huge fan of sweet wines, but if you like a sweeter Riesling, I think this would be something for you to try. Aroma-wise, I got lime. Also, like the biggest thing was like, you know, as a kid, I had a lot of those fruit cocktail cups, and I really liked to drink the juice out of the bottom of it as a kid. That is what this wine smelled like. It smelled like the fruit cocktail juice, either out of those like little plastic cups or like the can. And then also very like pear juice. And so, yeah, this wine, along with smelling like it, also tasted like the juice from a fruit cocktail cup, which young Haley would have loved. Older adult Haley doesn't necessarily like that much sweetness. Now, in 4th place was the only wine alternative that I tried that evening. And this was the non-NON1 salted raspberry chamomile, which is quite the flavor. In the original, so when smelling it, that's the first thing I did with each of these, it was overwhelming raspberry. Like, it was off-putting until I realized like what it was. Like, that's how overwhelming it was. But then I realized it was like basically like I would crush raspberries like maybe before you make a sauce, or like I would always put them on my ice cream. So like it just smelled like crushed raspberries. In terms of flavor, there was a tiny oomph of body and a little bit of depth, but it mostly just tasted like raspberry juice, which isn't bad, but isn't really something I want to drink a lot of. So that was 4th place. 3rd place, now we're getting into the wines that I would recommend for the most part for people. And these were also the 3 that I got at Cheeky and Dry if you are local to Seattle. So the first one was Prima Pave Blanc de Blancs. This is a dealcoholized sparkling white wine from Italy. This is the one that confused me that said alcohol-free when actually it probably does have small traces of alcohol. Again, aroma here, any non-alcoholic wine, like especially the whites, get a lot of pear juice, a lot of fruit cocktail for me. That's what I tend to get. On the flavor, to me, the bubbles were overwhelming. They were just like big bubbles. I can't really figure out how to describe it. To be fair, I don't love carbonated drinks and I'm kind of picky with bubbles in wine. I really prefer kind of the small, delicate bubble. This one too, I noticed like when I got the bubbles, they were overwhelming and they were also kind of flavorless. Like it just kind of felt like I had bubbles in my mouth for no reason and there was no flavor going on. But there was no bad aftertaste. So I think if you're okay with carbonation, you would enjoy this. But to me, it also lacked, like to me, a sparkling wine always has this like yeasty bread kind of undertone. And this didn't really have any of that. It was very one-noted of just the fruit. Now, second place was a red wine, surprisingly. And it mostly made it up here because I was surprised by how much I did enjoy it for a red wine. And it was the Sovi, which is Sovi, their Red Reserve. And I believe, I don't have the bottle with me and I didn't write it down, but I think it was a blend of like Tempranillo and Malbec, and obviously dealcoholized though. So to me, the smell was great. It reminded me of a California Cab, so very, very oaky. It was like vanilla, cherry, chocolate, cedar, and herbs. The taste after having all that great smell was a little disappointing, but what I need to do is I need to experiment. So when I picked this wine up at Cheeky and Dry, the associate there told me a trick they'd figured out. Many red wines are flat and like super light bodied. They're missing the weight that you would expect from a red wine. So to fix that, they've been adding bitters. And you can use non-alcoholic or alcoholic bitters. I mean, alcoholic bitters have such a small amount that, it's barely noticeable. But the bitters just have to have a glycerin in them, which most of them do. Add that to the non-alcoholic red wine, and they said it really ups the body. I meant to try that before recording, but just didn't have time. So I can do an update. I'll make sure I do it before this episode releases so then I can give you an update on my social media over at Cork and Fizz and let you know. Also recommend that you try it. Okay, last but not least, our first place non-alcoholic wine of that evening, at least, was Joyous, Joyus, Sparkling Rosé. And I hope I wasn't biased with this. I'm really excited that this was first place. This is actually created by, it's a female-owned brand and also local here to Seattle. So this was really exciting. But the smell was really lovely. It was like fresh strawberries, cranberry, and kiwi. The flavor, I could just describe as like pleasant. There was a hint of sweetness. To me, it had smaller bubbles than the other sparkling that I had. And you get the flavor right away. Like in the bubbles, like to me, I need to get that flavor. Otherwise, the bubbles are just like, why are there bubbles in my mouth? So this one was lovely. This is my top recommendation of all the non-alcoholic wines. And honestly, my favorite de-alcoholized as well. I think on a blog post that I did previously, which you can also find on my website, I did a ranking of non-alcoholic wines, mostly ones that you can get at the store. And I included more wine alternatives on that one. And my top 2 on that list were actually wine alternatives. So says a lot for this Joyous sparkling wine that I liked it as a de-alcoholized wine. If you want to check out that ranking that I did, I think it was about a year ago now, maybe 2. But a lot of the wines are still available, or the non-alcoholic or wine alternatives are still available. And a lot of them can be found at your local grocery store, where the ones that I tried for this podcast were a little bit harder to find. You might need to order them online or have a non-alcoholic bottle shop near you to try. Okay, so what are your thoughts on non-alcoholic wine? Would you ever try them? Message me on Instagram at Cork and Fizz or email me, Haley@corkandfizz.com, to share your thoughts. I'm very curious. If you loved this episode as much as I did, I'd so appreciate if you could take a quick second to rate it and leave a review. And if you know a wine lover in your life or somebody who's curious about non-alcoholic wines, please share it with them. Obviously, this channel is primarily about wines that contain alcohol, but if they want to learn, send this episode to them. In next week's episode, I'll be chatting with Jane Lopes. Jane is a Nashville-based sommelier, author, and importer. I know her best as the author of one of my other favorite wine books, Vignette, Stories of Life and Wine in 100 Bottles. It's great. If you haven't read it yet, go check it out. But since writing the book, she's also created an Australian wine import business with her husband and written a book all about Australian wine. So we're going to be talking about all of that, plus her past and how she got all the different restaurants that she's worked out. It's going to be super fun. Thanks again for listening. And as a thank you, I'd like to share that free shopping guide, 15 wines under $15. Simply head to my website, corkandfizz.com, scroll down to the bottom, and join my mailing list. Cheers!